This is the generation of them that seek his face. This is the generation of them that seek his face.
Shabbat Shalom, bienvenidos this morning. Today we are going to continue our study on the preparation of Passover. We need to learn Passover from a Mosaic, a Messianic, and an apostolic way of doing it. Not just from tradition, not from what you see on the internet or all, but let's go to the Word and see what the Word says. And there are secrets to Passover that a lot of people don't know. In fact, there's secrets to Passover that many Jewish rabbis don't know, that many Catholic priests don't know, that many Protestant ministers don't know, and that we need to discover Pesach. What is Passover? Now, I present this to the body of Messiah. I present this to the scholarly, to those of you that are scholars, academics. I present this to every rabbi, those of you that come from a rabbinical perspective, to those of you that come from a Roman Catholic, Episcopal perspective, those of you that come from Protestantism, from evangelicalism, from Pentecostalism, those of you that know and want to earnestly contend. Remember, Jude says, earnestly contend for the faith that was once delivered to the saints, to the holy ones, to the body of Messiah. You all, that's you, that's us. That wasn't only the first apostles to disciples, to those around them, but that's, the word is to us. And it's important that we today continue to earnestly contend, earnestly go back to Scripture and say, wait a second, we've been doing it wrong. Look, let's change. Let's repent. Let's go back. And so I humbly submit this to you. Now, there are secrets. Well, they're not really secrets. They're more like lost, stolen, forgotten, and unknown decrees, statutes, procedures that need to be discovered and restored. For example, what is the date of Passover? That's a controversial thing today. Where and when can a Passover be done? A lot of people say any place, any time. What did Yeshua and Paul teach us about Passover? How do Jews and Christians celebrate Passover? Again, variety of ways. These and other questions will be explained and deliberated in this study. But first, I have a disclaimer. And this disclaimer, number one, says I don't know everything. You've heard me say that many times and before. And while we may all be wrong, we can't all be right. So as I submit this to the public, as I give this out, not just to you that are here, but to the public that is listening to us on Facebook and YouTube and going all around the world. We are literally going out all around the world. None of us know everything. There's no one that knows everything. And many of us think we're right, but we could be wrong. I could be wrong. So this is why we need that. You tell me and I tell you. I question you, you question me. And we could come and learn together. Especially my Jewish friends. My Jewish friends that have blessed me so much. And we've learned a lot. There's things that I would even today say, let's give up a lot of tradition that is on our backs. And let's come to a biblical understanding, which is not only Mosaic, but also Messianic. Our Jewish friends are missing out on the Messianic and the apostolic truth of Scripture. And so we need to come back. We need to restore. Now, while I don't know everything, there's one thing I do know. One thing I do know. I know that 2 + 2 = 4. And I hope everyone else knows that. Now, there's two other things that I also know. I know that 2 + 2 does not equal 5. I know that 2 + 2 does not equal 3. I know that 2 + 2 = 4. And you can't add and take away from that and make 2 + 2 equal whatever you want. Now, it's important that we really get to Scripture. Deuteronomy 4:2, you must add nothing to what I command you, and take nothing from it, but keep the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim, just as I lay them down for you. The commandments, the mitzvot. Deuteronomy 12:32. Do all I command you. Do not add to it or take away from it. 2 + 2 = 4. Proverbs 30, verse 6. Do not add to his words, or he will rebuke you and prove you a liar. I won't prove you a liar. He will prove you a liar. Do not add to his words. And of course, Revelation, a verse that every Christian, every Messianic is familiar with. Everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book, and of course that's just for the book of Revelation. That's not for the whole word, but with the other scriptures there, we know that it says what? If anyone adds to them, if anyone takes away from these words, there's curses if you add to the book of the prophecy of Revelation or take away from that prophecy. That's why I'm very careful when it comes to the book of Revelation and interpreting, the 10 heads mean this, or the mark of the beast is this. I'm very careful because I do not want to add or take away. I don't want to be legalistic. I want to be careful because we're dealing here with the word of Elohim, the most precious thing there is, the word of Elohim. And so it needs to be handled gently. It needs to be handled carefully, with much prayer, with humility that we must have. Now, Moses and the Passover. Let's begin with Moses. Passover was given to Moses by Adonai. It was by faith. It was by faith that Moshe, kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood to prevent the destroyer from touching any of the firstborn sons of Israel. It was by faith. When Adonai spoke to him, when Adonai came by grace and spoke to him, it was by faith, by trusting in the word of Adonai. And when Adonai says, what I want you to do is I want you to kill a lamb. I want you to slay that lamb between the two evenings on the 14th of Aviv. And I want you to get a hyssop and dip it in the blood and put the blood on the doorposts and lintels of the house. That wasn't a magic spell. That was an incantation. That was Adonai telling him, you do this and you will be rescued. You do this and you will be set free. Do this and you will be redeemed. And by faith, by trust, he does that. And he puts that, and when he puts that blood, the grace of Adonai that had been given him by the blood of the Lamb and his faith, Adonai blessed. And so Adonai asks us today, by faith, do the Passover. Everything that he tells us to do in a Mosaic, Messianic, and Apostolic Passover, do Passover this way. And when we do it his way, by faith, it's a faith act. Now, Judaism does Passovers in the Mosaic with additions of man. The Christians do Passover in the Messianic with the subtractions of man. So Judaism adds, Christianity takes away. Both in those are incorrect. They're not using the faith that Adonai says, do this, don't do that. Don't add, don't take away. The Seder, the liturgy, the order of service, which are all the same word. You could call it the Passover Seder, you could call it the Passover liturgy, you could call it the Passover order of service. That service, that liturgy, that is done by faith because he told us, do this. Now, the Berean synagogue, I was going down one of the streets here and I saw a Berean Baptist church, and there's Bereans, Episcopal, Berean, Lutheran churches, and a lot of churches use the term Berean. The term Berean actually is a city in Asia Minor, the city of Berea, and there was a synagogue, a Jewish synagogue. I never heard of a Berean synagogue, but it was a synagogue in the city of Berea, and they accepted the word of Paul by faith in that city. And it says, with readiness of mind, when Paul spoke to them, it says, with readiness of mind, they received the word. But they went home and searched the scriptures to see if what Paul said was true. And I'm going to ask you to do the same thing. Please accept what I'm teaching you today with readiness of mind. Open your mind to receive. Do not be closed-minded. But I still challenge you, like the Berean Jewish believers, they went home, and I ask you, go home and see if what I am saying is true. By the way, if what I'm saying is not true, I'm going to ask you to do one thing. You tell me. You rebuke me. You show me where I'm wrong. And I will gladly, happily say, you know what, brother? You're right. And I never saw it that way. Let me start doing it that way. That's what we all need to do. Now, the biblical calendar, and again, some of this we went over last week. Again, Genesis 1:14, talking about the creation of the lights in the vault of heaven to divide day from night. Let them indicate festivals. The word festivals, of course, is the word moed or moedim in plural. And this was on the fourth day. This is before man was created. And so the moedim, the appointed times, were created in Adonai before the creation of man. And of course, Leviticus 23, we saw last week, are the festivals. We looked at the festivals. Of course, the word moed or moedim means a festival, a season, an appointed time, a date, an appointment. Mikra Kodesh, sacred assemblies, a meeting, a conference, a rehearsal. These are the moedim of Yahweh, even Mikra Kodesh, which you shall proclaim at their appointed time. And again, last week we saw the feasts. There are 7 feasts. And the spring feast, which is important for us, is Pesach or Passover, the days of unleavened bread, Chag HaMatzah, the day of first fruits, Bekurim, and the feast of weeks, Shavuot. And we're going to be continuing our study on these as we go along. We looked at Passover last week. Again, Passover means to pass in between. As an eagle does to protect her nest from predators. It's a defensive passing over. It's a coming in between, a mediatorship. And we know that the Passover lamb, Yeshua, is our mediator. And he has been our fighter, our warrior from the beginning. It is Yeshua that protected us and protected the firstborn. Again, we've been studying that for the last several weeks. Again, it begins with the 10th day of the month, taking a lamb. And again, Passover is forever. We saw that again last week. It's a forever ordinance. So if it's forever, it should never, never, never have been taken off. It has been lost. It was stolen from us. The Passover was stolen from the early church Catholic believers, from Protestants, from evangelicals, and while some are coming back to Passover, sadly they're going to wrong Passovers. And it's important for us to say we need to come back to a true Mosaic Passover, but also Messianic and Apostolic. So Passover is forever. We also saw that the days of unleavened bread are from the 15th of the same month for 7 days. So from the 15th to the 21st day of the month are the days of unleavened bread. The Feast of First Fruits, talking about a third feast. Passover's one feast. The 7 days of unleavened bread are a second feast. And a third feast is the Feast of First Fruits, which occurs on the day after the weekly Sabbath after Passover. So the weekly Sabbath, every Passover will have a weekly Sabbath, and the day after, which is also a Yom Rishon, or a Sunday in the pagan calendar that is used today in the world, a Sunday, also called the Gregorian calendar, a Roman Catholic calendar, that the Protestants and pretty much the rest of the world uses. But it's the day after the Sabbath. And of course, the Feast of Weeks, and the fourth spring feast, from the day after the Sabbath, which is celebrated on Yom Rishon. You'll count 7 full weeks, 7 Shabbats, to the 7th Shabbat, and 7 weeks equals 49 days plus 1, 50 days, where we get the word Pentecost in English. Of course, everything begins with the beginning of moons. We spent a lot of time on this last week, and on our Wednesday nights we've been spending a lot of time on this. Yahweh spoke to Moses and said, this month shall be the beginning of months, the first moon of the year. So the first moon of the year is the beginning also, not only of the first month of a month, but the beginning of the first month of the year. We determine that by the equinox, the crescent moon, and the barley in Aviv. And this determines when Passover is. And again, we spent a lot of time on this. But the most important thing is, regardless of the differences that we all have, let us hold fast to the profession of faith without wavering, for he who is faithful that promised. And let us consider one another to encourage unto love and good works, not forsaking the assembly of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, so much so, the more as you see the day approaching. And so as we see the last days approaching and the coming of Yeshua approaching, let's assemble ourselves for Passover. But the most important thing, let's love one another. Yes, there's going to be some differences. Some of those differences are okay. But some of the differences are not okay, because some of the differences are going to be unbiblical. Now, if we hold fast in love, in unity, in holiness, then we will be pleasing to Adonai, which is what we need to be in everything. Now, what is Passover? Remember, Passover was the historic purchasing of Israel from Pharaoh in Egypt, the first Passover. The first Passover, historic purchase. Redemption, the word redeem means to purchase. One of the misnomers or misinformation that people have is that salvation is free. No, it's not. Salvation is not free. Salvation cost. It was very expensive. The expense of salvation, in the case of Passover, was the blood of the Lamb. The cost of world salvation was the cost of the Lamb of Elohim, Yeshua. And let me tell you, excuse me, that's very expensive. Now, he gives it as a gift to whoever wants it, whosoever will. It is a gift, but it wasn't free. It is a gift to us, but it cost. And so the purchase price has to be taken into account. And in the first Passover, we see that purchase price. In the Messianic Passover, we see that purchase price once again. Passover is also a yearly feast that recalls that event. When somebody says, are you celebrating Passover? They're talking about the yearly feast that celebrates the first Passover. And to us, the third Passover is the day Yeshua inaugurated the new covenant and died for the sins of mankind. Now, Yeshua inaugurated in his last Passover, not his last supper, but his last Passover, inaugurated the new covenant when he lifted up the cup and he says, this is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. Now, Yeshua celebrated, and only in the Jewish calendar can you do this. Yeshua celebrated the Passover on the 14th of Aviv and died on the 14th of Aviv on the same day of Passover. Now, that is important for us to understand. Yeshua gave us the cup and the bread of Passover on the same day that he gave his life. And that's part of my thesis. That's part of this dissertation that I want to present to the body of Messiah, that we need to look at that, because part of the misunderstanding of the date of Passover is the misunderstanding that he celebrated Passover on the same day he died. Most people say that he celebrated Passover on the wrong day, or that he didn't celebrate Passover, that he initiated what they call the Eucharist or the Mass or Holy Communion, the Lord's table. And the next day was the real Passover. And then they have this idea that he died when the Passover lamb was being killed. Oops. There is no Passover lamb. Passover was not a national celebration, one Passover for the nation. It was a domestic Passover where every family had their own lamb and sacrificed their own lamb. And a lot of people don't know that. Passover was the historic purchasing of Israel from pharaohs of Egypt. Again, we saw this last week. All this we saw last week by the blood of the Lamb. I want you to take a look at this picture. By the blood of the Lamb. By the blood of the Lamb. I'm sorry, but he intended it to be graphic. He intended it to be graphic. Now think of this. The lamb was selected on the 10th of Aviv. And it was brought home. It was just a 1-year lamb. It wasn't an old goat or an old lamb. It was a young male, 1-year-old. No blemishes, no defects. A cutie little lamb. And the children would clean it every day. They'd have to wash it because for Passover it had to be presentable. Then you take that little 1-year-old lamb and you bring it and you slay it. Think of the graphicness of that. Today even more because we don't see that so much. Passover also calls the yearly Passover, that feast. We are told to let our children know, by the way, Passover is for children. I remember one time when I was learning about this in the 70s, we were going to do a Passover. And we had a small group, so I was teaching them about Passover. And one of the elders says, you know what we need to make sure we do? Let's leave, get babysitters for your kids. We like that we could really do a really good Passover without the kids bothering. Oops. Passover is for the kids. It's to pass on the redemption, not only of Moses, but the redemption of Yeshua to the next generation. This is an audio-visual demonstration of the purchase price. And so the celebratory meal, the eating and the talking and the asking questions and the kids running in and out is part of the Passover celebration. So whenever you do Passover, I say make sure, and have your kids there. Don't send them to babysitters. Bring your grandkids in. Borrow some from the neighbors. Maybe there's a rent-a-kid program out there. Don't kidnap some kids. But bring some kids. Have kids over. Because remember, they're innocent. And it's for them that Passover is to be celebrated. And we encourage everybody to do that. The following Passovers are always in 2 parts. Again, it was the 10th that the lamb was selected. The 14th, you slay the lamb. You eat it with bread, unleavened bread and bitter herbs at home with the father presiding. Not the priest, not the rabbi, not the minister, but the father. And it's important that Passover is a father's duty. Every one of you that's a father, this is your duty. your duty. This is a responsibility, an accountability that every one of you, Father, has to tell the story. The old story of Moses, of the firstborn lamb, of Yeshua, of his sacrifice. Now, the locations of the sacrifice, the first Passover was in the home at Goshen. We saw that. The second and subsequent Passovers were done at the tabernacle from the wilderness to Shiloh, then to Jerusalem. From the time of Solomon's first temple, only in Jerusalem. Outside of Jerusalem, you could only have a remembrance meal with no lamb. So it's a home fellowship. Passover is not a church event. It is not a synagogue event. Many congregations have congregational Passovers. It is not a congregational event. If someone invites you to their congregation, say, no, I'm having it at home. We're doing it at home. We don't go to congregational events, whether they're Jewish or Christian, Jews for Jesus or anybody else. And there's the baking of the unleavened bread. I would encourage you, there are unleavened bread that you could buy at the store, but I would encourage you to make your own unleavened bread. Now, those of you that come from a Sephardic Jewish tradition, we have the tortillas, and the tortillas are unleavened bread. There was someone passing some information that it is illegal to have tortillas for Passover. No, it's not. In fact, they are more Hebraic than these matzah bread. The reason they're square is because of the machinery. The machinery that is used to make them, it's easier if they're square rather than if they're round. And so I would encourage you to make your own masa, make your own dough. You could add any other spices to it. And so go pick your own bitter herbs. Dandelion roots are good bitter herbs. Most people use horseradish today. But getting your own bitter herbs from the roots of dandelions, onions, or any type of roots would be more, again, the way our ancestors did it. They roasted the lamb at home. Today we do not have lamb because, again, as we said in weeks prior, that was something that was done only in Jerusalem during the temple time, 70 AD till the present. We have no temple, we have no priesthood, no Kohen Hagadol, but we prepare other foods for the meal. And other foods could be whatever you want as long as it's kosher. As long as it's a kosher meal, chicken, roast beef, rack of lamb, whatever you want to have for the meal. And then part two is telling the story. That old story. And it's eaten festively and joyfully as you would any joyful celebration. Of course, there was subsequent Passovers, Joshua, Kings, Chronicles. We looked at those on Wednesday night quite a bit. During the Babylonian exile, 70 years that we were in exile, I don't know what happened. Nobody knows. We don't know how they celebrated a remembrance meal. We don't know. But what I know is that they taught it to their children. How do I know that? Because Ezra was born in the exile. And when Ezra came back to Jerusalem to rebuild the second temple, 70 years later, he came back to build the second temple. He came with what I call a turnkey operation. He taught everybody how to do the Passover because many people hadn't done it, especially the people that lived in Jerusalem. They didn't have teachers. All the teachers were taken to Babylon. So Ezra comes and they celebrate a Passover like they hadn't celebrated for years and years and years. And so they knew what to do. They knew the ritual. They knew the Seder. They knew the liturgy because they had Moses. They didn't have other people adding and taking away. They only had Moses. So they did it the Mosaic way. Again, in the Second Temple period, we have where Nehemiah, Ezra, Zerubbabel rebuilt the temple, reinstituted Passover. The second Passover, the Second Temple Passover, this is the Passover in Yeshua's time. Yeshua lived in what's called the Second Temple period. They did the sacrifice at the temple, again called the Korban Pesach, where they sacrificed at the temple, and they brought the lamb home, roasted it, and they had the celebratory meal telling the story. And so Yeshua would have been the one that told the story to the disciples there at the Passover of Yeshua. Now, they knew the story. They had heard it all the way since they were small, and Yeshua did that. Now, the Passover procedure was the blessing, and all blessings began with a cup of the fruit of the vine. Now, this is kedem, sparkling grape juice. This is an Israeli non-alcoholic grape juice, and I would encourage everyone to use a non-alcoholic. Either Adhere is a brand of non-alcoholic grape juice, or one called Free. These are de-alcoholized wines, non-alcoholic, and of course many people use Welch's or another brand, but the sparkling and or the Ariel, any of those would be okay. And the Korban Pesach was a small portion, the size of an olive. They'd pass, and everyone in the table would get one. They'd eat it ritually, along with the matzah and the bitter herbs. And then they tell the story. And my father was a wandering Aramean. And they tell the story from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, how we got to Egypt and how we were enslaved and how the 10 plagues and gets us to the Passover. And after that, we have a meal with a second lamb, also called a chagigah. And Passover would end right here. In ancient days, in the Second Temple period, in the days of Yeshua, this is where Passover ended. They did not have Afikomen. They did not have a third cup. This was the end of Passover. Now, this is something very interesting, because today, the additions to the Mosaic Passover is a third cup and what is called the Afikomen. Now, where did that come from? Well, let's look at our journey. The Passover ritual elements are the Korban Pesach, which is the lamb. Korban Pesach. The Korban means the sacrifice of the Pesach. When they say the Pesach, the Passover, they're talking about the lamb. And of course, unleavened bread, bitter herbs. Unleavened bread, bitter herbs. And of course, there's the telling of the story. The father, as they're eating bread and the cup and bitter herbs, he tells the story to the family, to the kids. Yeshua himself, every year, Yeshua's parents used to go to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover. Remember, why did they go to Jerusalem? Why didn't they do Passover in Nazareth? Because you could only sacrifice the lamb in Jerusalem. Even they did not do it their own way. They did it the Mosaic way. And they went to Jerusalem because Adonai told Moses, when you get into the land and you find a place, only at the place that Adonai designates. And Jerusalem was the place that Adonai designated. He was 12 years old when they went up for the feast, as was their custom. In other words, they would do this every year. This is something, hey, it's Passover time, let's go to Jerusalem. Now, the third Passover is the day Yeshua inaugurated the new covenant and died for the sins of mankind. And in the same way, after supper, okay, remember we said there was a supper. Yeshua now inaugurates an after supper portion, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. When you drink it, do it as a memorial of me. Now, the first Passover, when they ate and drank, it was a memorial of the first Passover. And as Yeshua is doing a memorial of the first Passover, now he institutes a third part, or a part C. They only did part 1, which was the sacrifice. Part 2 was the Haggadah. And now Yeshua initiates a part 3. The disciples came to Yeshua saying unto him, where will you want that we prepare for you to eat the Passover? And here's where we have a problem. Because a lot of people are saying Yeshua did not celebrate Passover. Yes, he did. Well, if he celebrated Passover, why does it say? Then we have a contradiction in the Bible. Why does it say that when Yeshua, the next day, was before Pontius Pilate, the priests couldn't come in because they hadn't eaten the Passover. They hadn't celebrated Passover. Well, if Yeshua did the Passover the night before, the priests are doing the Passover, who should we believe, Yeshua or the authorities? Well, of course, that's a no-brainer, Yeshua. Why? Because they were wrong, and they are still wrong. 2 plus 2 equals 4. 2 plus 2 does not equal 5 or 3. It equals 4. So if Yeshua did it on the evening of the 14th, and the Pharisees and Sadducees, the Jewish religious people, were doing it on the evening of the 15th, which one is right? It doesn't say the 15th, it says the 14th. And to this day, they're doing it on the 15th, not the 14th. They did it in Yeshua's time on the 15th. Yeshua did it on the 14th. When are you going to do it? 14th or 15th? 14th. Because Yeshua did it. You see, I'm a disciple of Yeshua. I want you guys to be disciples of Yeshua. Not disciples of the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. Not disciples of the Roman priests or Greek ministers. Or we want to be disciples of Yeshua. And his disciples went forth and they made ready the Pesach, the Passover. In other words, they got the unleavened bread, they got the lamb prepared and slaughtered and brought it to the upper room. And they had the unleavened bread, the bitter herbs. They got everything ready. They set the table up. Again, the part A was the sacrifice at Herod's temple that year. The disciples sacrificed the lamb, prepared the upper room. They did the Seder, the Haggadah. Yeshua and the disciples gathered together. And of course, Yeshua says, I have longed to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Because I tell you, I shall not eat it again until it's fulfilled in the kingdom of Elohim. In other words, that was Yeshua's last Passover, his next Passover. And after we go home to be with Adonai, the next Passover we're all going to celebrate in the kingdom together. Can you imagine that? In the kingdom, we're all going to celebrate his Passover. And Passover, by the way, is going to be sacrificed in the millennial kingdom. This is the triclennium banquet. This is how, in the first century, a banquet was done. The host, in today's tables, the host is always here, right? With two wings. In the first century, the host was in this position. The host was the second person. Whoever was holding the meal was in the second position. This position here is the youngest. So this would have been John. The third position was the guest of honor. The guest of honor always sat to your left and the youngest person to your right. Now, you would sit, and several times during the meal, you would lay on your left elbow and you'd stretch out as in relaxing. You would do this. Now, if this person is here, and this person is here, and this person is, we're all facing that way, and this person wants to talk to me, what would he do? He turned this way, and his head would, now if he was here, and he turned this way, his head would be on my chest. And remember, it says John went and he was laying on Yeshua's chest. And so we know that that was John. Now, what they would do, and you know this from Proverbs, is that when a host gave a meal, he would go to his guests and say, you're number one, you're number two, number three, number four, number five. When you went to a meal, you couldn't sit down wherever you wanted to. Because what if you were the worst guy in the neighborhood and you sat in the position of honor? What the scripture says, you could be told, go take the last seat. And you in the last seat, you take the first seat. So you never sat where you wanted, you sat where your host told you. Well, in this meal, guess who's at the last table? That's Peter. That's Peter over here. Now, we know this because Yeshua went around washing their feet, and lastly, he came to Peter, and Peter says, no, you will not wash my feet. But right there, you see Judas, and Judas and Yeshua are dipping the matzah. They're dipping a piece of matzah into the bitter herbs together, into what's called the sop in King James Bible. Now, those of you, again, and for those of you that might be listening from other parts of the country, here in New Mexico, whenever we go to a restaurant or at home, one of the most important things that is done is a little dish with red sauce called salsa and some tortilla chips, nachos, or whatever are given to us. And before we eat, we all dip our unleavened bread into our bitter herbs. We do this every day. Every day that we eat, every day we go to a restaurant, we do that. But here we see Judas and Yeshua dipping at the same time. And remember, Yeshua says at this time, one of you is to betray me. Peter here, the gospel says, motions to John with, who's he talking about? And so, because Peter was far away, he could not hear that conversation. So he's asking John, what did Yeshua say? And so we see here at this time, Judas takes off. If you remember, at this time, Judas takes off. So this triclinium, or three-sided table, banquet, diponon, it's called a diponon, a banquet, we see in Yeshua's Passover. This is the way they did the Passover, in the upper room. Now, there's a third part of Passover now, a part C. And this is what I call the Messianic Memorial. And Yeshua now institutes a third part to the Passover of Moses. Yeshua predicted the destruction of the temple, anticipating the end of the sacrificial system for a time. He institutes a memorial of himself with the unleavened bread as his body, and the cup with the fruit of the vine as his blood. Yeshua was not replacing the Passover, but adding to it an after supper portion of part 3. And this is important. He was not replacing the Passover. He was adding a third part, a part that had never been done before. Again, he took the bread, gave thanks. When he gave thanks, by the way, in Greek, this would be the word Eucharisto, where the word Eucharist comes from. To most people, the Eucharist is the wafer that the Roman Catholics use for the bread. The Eucharist is not the bread or the wine. The Eucharist is the words that are said for the blessing, Eucharisto, a good word. And of course, that when he gave thanks, he says, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Blessed are you, Adonai, King of the universe. You've given us bread from the earth. The Jews do that not only at Passover, but at Erev Shabbat, at any meal that is given, at any wedding, anytime you bless food, you bless the cup, you do these. It did the same with the cup after supper. Remember, supper had finished. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. And again, he says a blessing with it. The Passover celebration was on 14th of Eve at sundown, what we call Passover Day. Yeshua died on Passover, the 14th of Aviv, a Wednesday that year, at 3 p.m. Yeshua was buried on the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the 15th of Aviv, Wednesday sundown, the 5th day of the week. Yeshua resurrected on first fruits, the first day of the week, Aviv 18th, Saturday at sundown. So on Yeshua's Passover, he died, he was buried, and he resurrected on Passover, on the first day of unleavened bread, and on first fruits. And it's important that we know that. Yeshua did not die on Good Friday. Yeshua did not die on Good Friday and did not rise on Easter Sunday morning. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the great fish, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. From Wednesday at sundown to Saturday at sundown is 3 days and 3 nights. or 72 hours. People need to know this. Again, look at all the misinformation that we've been told all these years. These are the 3 days and 3 nights. This chart, by the way, we have available here on Wednesday night. If you come, we could give you one of these charts. And I made this chart. Here's the days of the week in the Gregorian calendar, our calendar today, Tuesday, Wednesday. That day, it was the third day, the 13th of Aviv. Yeshua on the 14th of Aviv. Watch, his Passover Seder was here at the beginning. As it went from day to night, evening, in between the two evenings, the sacrifice was done. And at this point, on this day, you see the times there where he went to Gethsemane. He was arrested, the trials, and the crucifixion at 9 o'clock, and his death at 3 o'clock. And he was buried on the day of unleavened bread here. And there's 3 days and 3 nights between there and on the Sabbath. At the end of the Sabbath, he resurrected. So remember, Yeshua resurrected on what we call Saturday night. But the modern Saturday night is the biblical first beginning of the first day of the week. So Yeshua resurrected on the first day of the week. But remember, in our counting, it was Saturday night. He did not resurrect in the morning time. In fact, the women went to the grave, as we're going to see this Wednesday. They went to the grave while it was still dark, and the earthquake happened. It was still dark, and when they got there, the stone had been rolled away already. Already the stone had been rolled away. And so please join us on Wednesday, and you could get one of these charts. Again, it was a Tuesday at sundown, Passover, Gethsemane, 9 to 3 p.m. death, 15th, burial, 16th, 17th, 18th, resurrection. Just another way of that chart. Only part 2 could be celebrated outside of Jerusalem after 70 A.D. The apostles celebrated parts 1, 2, and 3 for 40 years between Yeshua and the destruction of the temple. After 70 A.D., the apostles only celebrated part 2 and part 3. Passover is a yearly reminder and memorial of his death until the second coming. Every time you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the master's death. Now, every time it says, every time you do this, by the way, a lot of people say, well, look at that. It says every time. That means we could do it any time. But let me ask you a question. If I were to actually say, every time, please pray this prayer every time you guys have turkeys giving, Thanksgiving. That's only one day a year, right? But every time you have turkey and with all the trimmings and all this, or every time you do fireworks, it's 4th of July. When you're talking to people that know what's going on, you don't have to explain. So that every time you eat this bread, remember, when Yeshua says, every time you eat this bread and every time you drink this cup, well, what is this bread? What is this cup? This Passover. So what Yeshua was telling them, every time you do this in remembrance of me. What is the this? The this was Passover. They weren't having a weekly meal. They weren't having something else. They were having Passover. Every time you do this, Passover. Today we have to say every time you do this, Passover, do this in remembrance of me until he comes. Now, there's an accountability of Passover, and we're going to stop here. We're going to continue this next Shabbat. So I want to encourage everyone to join us next Shabbat as we continue our preparing for Passover. Yevarechecha Yahweh vaish merecha. Ayir Yahweh panav elecha vichunecha. Asa Yahweh panav elecha vayasem lecha shalom. May Yahweh bless you and keep you. May Yahweh make his face shine upon you, be gracious unto you. May Yahweh lift up the countenance of his face upon you and give you his peace. Shabbat Shalom. Have a good day. Shalom, Shalom. Welcome to Olive Tree Fellowship and Torah Unleashed Ministries. Thank you for joining us on our channel. If you have enjoyed this teaching and would like to see more, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to click the notification bell so that you can be notified when we have new videos. If you would like to support Olive Tree Fellowship and Torah Unleashed Ministries, please visit us at olivetreefellowship.com or TorahUnleashed.org. We thank you for your past support and hope to continue with you. Shalom, shalom. Have a good day. Shalom, shalom y bienvenidos a Olive Tree y a la Torah desatada. Les doy gracias a ustedes y a Adonai por su apoyo que nos han dado aquí. Y si quieren continuar a hacer una donación, pueden ir aquí en TorahUnleashed.org o en olivetreefellowship.com y ahí pueden dar una donación. Su apoyo, su ayuda es importante en estos días. Shalom, shalom.